Don't you think that slide-based presentations are insanely boring? Don't you want to create something different that is stunning and may surprise your audience? Then you should use impress.js, a JavaScript framework that uses the power of CSS version 3 transformations. I mean, look at this. But how do you create such a presentation, you might ask? Well, you need to use HTML and CSS and, if you want to, JavaScript. This means you will need some quite decent HTML and CSS skills. With that out of the way, let's get started learning impress.js. There are two options to download impress.js. One of them is using a CDN or a content delivery network, where you do not have to download anything, you can just include a script tag. The downside of this is though, you need to have an internet connection while giving your presentation. If you have an internet connection, you can skip ahead. I've put a timestamp on the screen right now. If you have no internet connection, you should download impress.js to your hard drive, which you can do by going to the releases section on the impress.js GitHub and clicking on the latest version, which for me currently is version 2.0, and then download either the zip file or the tarball, depending on your operating system. Save it and then head into the directory you saved it to and extract it. I personally went with the tarball. You should now head into the extracted impress directory, where you can find all the files from the GitHub repo. This might look quite overwhelming because there's a lot of files in there, but the folder we're interested in is the JS folder, because in there you can find the impress.js file, which we will need in our presentation. Now, if you haven't already, you should create yourself a project folder. I will call mine my first presentation, and now we will also cd into it. As you can see, this folder is completely empty. Now that we have created our project directory, we will copy over the JS folder into the directory we just created. If we now head into the folder and list it, we can see there's a JS folder. So that part was successful. Now you should open up your project folder in your favorite text editor. In my case, this is Visual Studio Code, and create a new file that is called index.html. Yes, you should call it index.html. This is just common HTML naming schemes for the initial file of your project. Now that you have set up your HTML file, go back to the browser, to the impress.js GitHub, and head to the getting started.md guide and scroll down to setting up the project. Now copy this code block using this copy icon here and head back into your favorite text editor and paste it in. Now I will explain what everything does in this HTML file, so you just have a basic understanding on how impress.js actually works under the hood. First of all, we include a style sheet. This style sheet is called impress.common.css. It is in the CSS folder of the impress.js repository we just downloaded beforehand. If you want to use it, it makes your life slightly easier. You can copy over the CSS folder into your project directory. In this tutorial, we will not be using the impress.common.css file. I will show you how to do it in your own CSS. Next off, we have the body that is of class impress not supported, which is there by default, so Impress can remove it and replace it with impress supported if the browser supports all the features that impress.js needs. Next off, we have the fallback message. It is being displayed if Impress is not supported by your browser, which is a very rare occurrence nowadays, but you might be happy to have it if somebody else wants to look at your presentation and their browser doesn't support it. Now we come to the most important div of the entire file, which is the div that has the ID impress, in which you will build out your entire presentation. And impress will animate everything that is within this div. Now inside this impress div, we have more divs that belong to the class step. A step is basically a slide in impress.js. Now you may notice that this div has an ID. This is absolutely not required, it just makes the URL in the browser look a little nicer. And finally, we load the impress.js file. First of all, we try to load the impress file from your local machine, but if this fails, we are going to load it from the content delivery network jsdeliver.net. And finally, we initialize impress with impress opening closing brackets .init opening closing brackets. So now that you have understood how impress.js works in the HTML, we are going to create a new folder that is called CSS and add a new file that is called style.css. In this file, we have to add the following lines of code: .impress supported, .fallback message, curly brackets, display, none. So if there's an impress supported, the fallback message will not be displayed. Let's head back into the index.html file and remove the impress common and replace it by style.css. Now you may want to look at your presentation you've created. So you head back into your project directory in your file explorer and open up the index.html file in your favorite web browser. And just like that, you can see your presentation. If your presentation looks as mine does right now, you have done everything right and impress was initialized correctly. You can see it by this h1, which is just a header, being centered and as small as it possibly can be without wrapping the words. With that out of the way, we head back into our text editor. Now that you've seen your presentation, it may look quite boring, which I totally agree, so we can just add some styling. For the body, for example, we can add a background color of blue, and let's head back into the browser, reload the page, and there we go, you're back in this blue now. One quick note on styling with CSS: be careful on styling the step class. It changes every single slide in your presentation. So personally, I try to avoid styling the step, except for things that has to apply to every single slide in the presentation. My suggestion then is to add a secondary class to your step div, for example my class, and style this class so you can dynamically add this class here to the slides that have to look the same. The most important thing though to keep in mind: do never mess with the positioning inside your presentation. You can, for example, add a div inside the step div, for example of class modify, and then modify this div. This one you can modify with positional arguments in CSS. Do never, ever change positioning of the div that has the class step. Now one thing you may have noticed is that this slide is quite narrow, so you might want to change the size of it. The easiest way to do this is to modify the step class, but as I told you just before, do only do this if you want to apply it to every single slide or step in your entire presentation. Personally, I just modify a class that I just pass into every div that has to have the styling. An important note on width and height: you cannot use relative, so you can't use percent, but you can use pixels and you can use viewport height and viewport width. So I'll just make 100% viewport width. And just like that, the text of my slide is on the left hand side of my screen. And now you can get creative on styling your presentations. Just remember to always put a secondary div inside the main step div if you want to mess with positioning. If you want to add a second slide, it's very simple. We just add another div. We do not give this one an ID. Class is step, and we just have another header that says my second slide. If we now head back into the Impress file, you just see it appearing straight up centered. This might be fine at some cases, but we probably want to position it on the canvas. So what we are going to do now, we add some arguments to the div. For example, data x equals, and then the number of pixels it has to be moved to the right of your screen. For example, 1000 pixels. And if you want to move it up down on your screen, you can just use data y equals 1000 pixels. Just be aware that this data y is not 1000 pixels up if the number is positive, but 1000 pixels down. So now if you reload our presentation, it's gone. And if we press our arrow keys, that's how we navigate Impress presentations. We just move down to the second slide. And with that, we have reached the end of the first part of this tutorial series. I hope you've enjoyed it. The next episode will be linked directly in the description below and also here in the end card. And I will also put a link to the impress.js GitHub down in the description box below. See you in the next tutorial.